Welcome to the Active Shooter Incident Management Podcast. My name is Bill Godfrey. I'm your podcast host. And I've got joining me back again today, Ron Ottebacker and Jill McElway, two of our C3 Pathways instructors. Thank you guys for coming back in.
Sure.
Anytime. Good to have you back here. It was funny just before we went on air. Jill, Carla, our producer, was doing a sound check with the mics, and Jill says, "Hey, does this mic make me sound like I have a Southern accent?"
It's most definitely the mic, I believe.
Yeah, it's the mic. That was.
I'm from up north.
It's still
North Georgia.
It just. Is there a South Georgia?
Well, Jacksonville.
Oh,
where I'm actually from.
Okay, so today's topic is lost in translation. One of the reasons I asked the two of you back for this one is we left off the other one and we made the comment we could do a whole podcast series on terminology. And once we got off air, we started having a conversation, and there was no lie. We could make a whole podcast series on terminology, and so I love the name, lost in translation. Where do we want to start on this one? It's you know what? I'm gonna start us off with something that I always makes me laugh every time I hear it. We talked a little bit in the last podcast about over naming the teams, and how we could just do building blocks with contact teams and rescue task force, and you can create whatever you need to from there. But the term that always makes me laugh a little bit is the idea of a rescue team separate from a rescue task force. And I just chuckle because I'm like, y'all really think people are going to get that and keep that straight? Because I hear with such frequency, RFT3 to they can't even necessarily get the acronym right when they're under stress. How in the world are they going to do it? So let's jump off and talk about some of the challenges with terminology and overcomplicating it. Jill, you want to lead us off today?
Yeah, sure. I think that what we have to remember is the environment that we're operating in, where we train in a nice room such as our training facility here, and it's easy when that stress level is as low. What we've got to make sure that we're incorporating, and which we have in our program, is that the terminology is simplified. And we've made some changes along the way. We learned, from doing this, from actually being in the street and hearing things back and forth from different, either if it's cross-jurisdictional or if it's cross-discipline from, fire to police. We've learned that the simpler we can keep this terminology, the more likely we are to remember that when we're at a heightened level of awareness. When we have all of the stressors, we've got to maintain our head on that swivel. We are looking at knowing the area of responsibilities that each of these teams have and aligning those teams with a simplified, clear term is key. And when we start drilling down and having everyone have a name, and as opposed to just knowing that this is a part of the rescue task force. A rescue task force has a security component. It has a medical component. We don't need each of those components to then have their own names. So I think with the terminology, keeping it clear, we've learned that through just in the National Incident Management System. One of the key components of that is a common terminology. It's like, hey, things do get lost in translation when you're working an event that's going to have multiple disciplines, multiple jurisdictions. So those are some of the things we've learned.
Yeah. It's interesting because under ICS doctrine within NIMS, there is really not a ton of limits on what kind of creative names or descriptive names you can come up with things. But there's a few places where there's some keywords that are reserved and things like that. And I want to make sure that we come back and talk to them about. But Ron, I got to ask, because you and I were together back in 2012 when we first started trying to craft what became the checklist, and we were doing some testing and some trial runs. Do you remember when we used to call what is triage now for us rescue group supervisor? Do you remember that?
Right.
Right. Yeah. RTF2 to rescue group. Yeah. Do you remember why we changed?
For simplification. They all sound the same, especially when everything gets heated. And I equate it back to when I was still on the job. Everyone in my agency knew what my call sign was. everybody knew what my call sign was. But when we have a follow-on responder, they have no clue.
Sure.
So if we use the titles, it simplifies it, and we've got to make sure, like we did then, is we remove the ones that sound similar, because it just adds confusion to everything that we do, and that's why we've changed a lot of the titles, but the functions have remained the same.
Yeah, I gotta ask you. I don't know if you'll remember this or not, but around the same time frame when we were working with that, we were trying to figure out what to call tactical, which at the time there was a huge sensitivity because tactical seemed to be kind of reserved for the SWAT team or the SWAT team leader or the SWAT team commander, and so we were counseled, you don't want to call it tactical. That's reserved for the SWAT team. And if my memory serves me, we called it contact group supervisor. So it was like contact 2 to contact group.
Right.
Yeah. How'd that work out for us?
Again, that's why we changed it. Yeah. And, the nice thing about it is when we've recognized that maybe we could do something better, we've always strived to improve what we do.
Yeah.
And where we are now is nowhere near where we started from, because we learned so much from not only actual incidents, but the training that we do on a constant basis. And to this day, if we find something that we think we can improve on what we do, we're not afraid to do it, and that's a constant thing.
Yeah, I mean it's a long. You talk about the constant improvement and changes. I mean, we spent a year working on that checklist and trying things and changing things and trying before we ever published it the first time, because there were some things that just didn't quite work out. And in fact, one of the key elements that really helped us square this away was the suggestion we got from the Lieutenant Colonel of Memphis PD about the fifth man, the idea of the fifth man. Because we were sitting, I don't know if you remember this, we were sitting at a conference having a meal with him. I think we were having lunch, and we were talking about some of the challenges with trying to get your management structure set up simultaneously with deploying your security forces. I mean, you got to go deal with the threat. You got to address the threat. But if we focus entirely on just addressing the threat and we don't manage this thing, we lose control of our resources real fast. And we were having that conversation at lunch. You remember that with him?
Yes, sir.
And he's like, well, it's funny. I had and I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but he was a very colorful guy. He was funny. But he said he had a similar problem, not related to active shooter events, but where in some places in his jurisdiction, he could get 25 or 30 officers on scene before the first sergeant showed up. And every time that happened, things just got a little bit messy. I'm paraphrasing what he said. You remember this conversation? Sir. Yeah. And he said, I finally just got fed up and said, the fifth person that's there, whoever they are, is not going to go in. They're going to stand outside and they're going to start organizing this thing and getting people organized into teams. And you and I looked at each other like, that's so simple. Why didn't we think of that? And I was excited to get back and try that. And boy, did it make a huge difference. Sure. Yeah.
And if you remember, the reason we started the active shooter incident management is after 99, everyone was training on tactics across the country. Every agency was focusing on tactics, but no one was focusing on the command structure of those tactics. You can have the best tactics in the world, and if you get a messed up command decision, then those tactics are out the window. So that's why we headed in this direction as a crew.
Oh yeah. And then there were other things that became plainly apparent. There's obviously some cultural differences between law enforcement and fire and EMS. They're not as big a gap, I think, as people sometimes assume they are. Because when you get everybody into the room, once you get done with the recliner jokes,
valid.
They're just jealous. They're just jealous. They are nice recliners. And the Xbox, once you get past all that, it's a lot of the very same humor and outlooks, which is, I think, kind of fascinating. But the other thing that we were seeing is fire department, who is used to setting command on everything, would set their own command post. And in many cases, they just did it because it's habit and because they assumed law enforcement hadn't done it or wouldn't do it. And there were so many incidents where we end up with a law enforcement command post, whether they actually officially designated as a command post or that's just where they were running stuff from. And then you'd end up with a fire command post someplace else. And that's a prescription for disaster.
Sure.
Exactly.
We saw a number of incidents where there was no staging for law enforcement at all. All the resources just flooded in. And so when you needed to organize some teams or assign some people, whether it was the contact teams or RTFs, there were no resources. All the resources had already kind of flooded in. So it was a number of interesting events, I think, that formulated this as we went through.
Sure. And aside from flooding in, they also self-deploy. So you have no idea who's at different locations, what they're doing. You know, they're trying to do the best they can. We understand that.
Sure.
But someone's got to get their arms around the situation, take control of it. And that's, you know, it comes back to, number one, what's the most important terminology we use is command. Command's the one that's responsible for everything.
Yeah.
And everything flows from command down and from down back up to command. So we've got to know who we talk to at different times. Like the way the structure is set, command may talk to law enforcement branch and medical branch. And those are the only two people he or she should be talking to. And then they're running everything downrange in their different areas. Like medical is talking to triage transport, and law enforcement branch talking to tactical perimeter or anything else they've got downrange. But most of the stuff he's talking to is, or he or she, please excuse me because I'm just slow. Most of that goes to that one person who's running everything downrange. So that should be, and if you limit the conversation between those, you also free up the most common problem we have in any major incident is the communications issue. And we see in these classes, and we've been teaching for a long time, I can tell you the middle of the second day, it's like someone turns the light switch on and people say, why didn't you tell me that earlier? We have, but it just took this long to get through that. You know, it simplifies the conversation. It lets you know who you're responsible for talking to and doesn't confuse things.
Yeah.
And to your point, Ron, we get oftentimes we'll hear fire. They'll say, "Well, I'm talking to my command."
Yeah.
No. There's no my command
Yeah,
in
exactly,
this. Yeah,
exactly.
It's our command, and
Yeah.
it's so important what you described as having those components together, because that when we're talking to with tactical and is talking to the contact team talking to tactical, the rescue task force talking to triage and transport ultimately. So but those components have to be together. They have to be on that same page, and then command of the incident is the overarching component in this entire structure that is running things. And we're all, we all were in the field for years before we put the white shirt on in the fire service. Before you became the big dog in the sheriff's office. We thought about even taking that promotional exam. I know every one of us did because we knew, that's going to get us out of doing this, being down at the ground level. So those positions aren't ones that people are flocking to, but the importance of it cannot be understated. And you stole my line, Ron, that second day of class, it's like the light bulb clicks and everyone understands how important it is to take a chaotic scene and bring order, some form of order to it, where we are staging assets. There's a term I heard years ago called chaotic, taking chaos. And that's like, someone, worked in the trauma center before, and one of the trauma surgeons, he said, man, it's looking chaotic in here. And we weren't sure what he meant by that. And so what he meant is that we got a lot of chaos. We had patients waiting, patients everywhere, but there was order to that. And so that's our ultimate goal, is to bring that order. But someone has got to take charge of that.
And, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all right. Go ahead.
To simplify it, this could be our command structure right here. Bill could be the incident commander. I could have law enforcement branch. He could have medical branch. Right. And the nice thing is, if Bill needs something, he just talks to us face to face.
Yeah, I don't need a radio.
If I need something, I simply tap Jill on the shoulder and say, Jill, this is what I need from you. And
Perfect.
She does the same thing. That's why it's so important. That's why we simplified it this way. We don't have to go through one dispatcher to another dispatcher to the command structure on that side, but it's one command structure, and we talk to each other face to face.
Yeah, and it's funny. We talked a little bit earlier about ICS be fairly open in the naming, except for a few things. There's a handful of reserved words,
Right.
and command is one of them.
That's it.
And I'll share for all of our brothers and sisters on the law enforcement side. I'll share for a little secret, and Jill, I know you're going to laugh. As much as the fire service thinks that we are such ICS experts, and just ask us, we'll tell you we are. There's some things that not so much. We've kind of bastardized, or is that too
Are
strong
you
way to
taking
say
the
it?
code of silence? You're breaking the code of silence,
I
Bill.
know. Yeah. The whole idea of I'm talking to my command, it makes me laugh. I mean, unified command is where we end up with this conversation along for a lot. There are so many people in the streets and the fire service especially that believe that unified command means, the law enforcement incident commanders talking to law enforcement troops, and the fire incident commander is talking to the fire troops, and the EMS incident commander is talking to the EMS folks. No. That's not what it is. It's not what it was ever supposed to be. It is a team that has a legal authority to be in response. Some legal authority or legal basis to be in charge, but it's not a clear jurisdictional thing. You've got more than one particular interest that needs to be represented, and you put that group together. But in order for that to work, they're supposed to be communicating with one person underneath them, which is the operations position. And then operations runs, wait for it, the operation. Yeah, mind blown. Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. So it's interesting because let's camp there for just a minute and talk about how we've heard command and operations thrown around and sometimes misused, because both of those are reserved words. And I've had some people that have really wanted to argue toe to toe that it's just semantics, and I've had to walk them through it and go, but it's not. There are. Whether you want to call it rescue group supervisor or triage, that's semantics. But when you're talking about operations or command, those are reserve words that were limited. And, and mind you, you guys both talked about the light bulb coming on. I mean, we've been doing this for over 10 years, just active shooter incident management training.
Right.
We've racked up over 150,000 hours of training with, we just went past 13,000 students trained, with 5,000 full scenarios from dispatch to last patient transported. So just a little bit of repetition here as we've gone through this. And like you said, Ron, we learn the lessons and adjust as we go. But the idea of command, my command, tactical command, forward command, no, it's really not complicated, and it's not us being ICS purist, is it, Jen?
Right. No. And like we chat, my handle or whatever it is on social media is ICS Nerd. Love all things ICS. I've seen.
Is it really?
Okay, now I've admitted. Yeah, it is.
I don't know, Ron. I don't think I'd have told that one.
And I even said I self-proclaimed ICS Nerd because I have seen it work. I've been unfortunate to be on a Type 3 team for the state of Florida on many incidents, and I've watched how the incident command structure works. And I've seen that as long as, we do abide by that structure and the process and the flow and the span of control and what we're talking about here, the common terminology, it prevents things from being lost in translation, because we're all going to shorten things up on the radio. So forward command, that just becomes command.
Yep.
On a radio.
Yeah.
Tactical command just becomes command on the radio. And there is what you've done is, to your point, you've bastardized that terminology. You're using it for something it's not to be used for. So
and introduced confusion.
Yes, yeah.
At a time when we don't.
Not necessary.
Yeah.
It's very simple. So exactly.
And then again, in that, the title not only gives you what your name is on the radio, but it also gives you your responsibilities. My title as operations chief was different than if I was running tactical or anything else. Tactical has certain responsibilities. Contact teams have certain responsibilities. RTFs have certain responsibilities. And if we go changing all those titles, RTF 1 to Rescue Group 7, what's the different responsibilities there? And that's where I think we end up messing up as we move into that realm. Is it tells you, again, like I said earlier, I don't have to know anything, but I do know someone's in command. So if I'm from another follow-on agency, I simply get on the radio, order to command. Where do you want me? Or if they've established staging, I go straight to staging. We understand that each title has its own responsibilities, and by understanding not only the title but those responsibilities associated with it, it lets us know who to talk to.
Yeah, I think it is really important to keep your eye on that ball of simplicity at the time, because as the incident unfolds, for most jurisdictions where they're going to have mutual aid partners in their teams very quickly, it doesn't matter what jurisdiction law enforcement officers are on contact 3. It does not, it couldn't matter less. What is contact 3 does security work. What are they assigned to?
Right.
What do I need them to go do? And moving them around. And the same thing with the RTFs. It doesn't matter a hill of beans who's on the RTFs. And, and here's the other thing that I think a lot of law enforcement, even some fire departments, forget is unless you're from a very large agency, your cops that are going to be the ones on the contact teams that are already in. The likelihood is the security that's going to be with you on your RTF is going to be your neighbors. Right. It's going to be your mutual aid folks. And if you're not all on the same page, how's that going to work out?
And again, having come from both realms, fire service and law enforcement, I understand that there's a lot of agencies say, well, we're just going to use our law enforcement folks as our RTFs, and we're going to go down and provide medical treatment. My question is I know how much training I went through to become a paramedic, and I know how much practical experience I had as a paramedic, and then going into law enforcement, are we sending someone in with basic first aid to try and provide advanced skills because we don't understand? Those are all things that we need to think about, just by the simplification of terms and simplification of what their responsibilities are. We understand that it may not be so easy to say, I'm sending all my cops down range, they're going to provide aid. That's good.
And I think I'm going to do this, Ron. Tell me if we were to say this, hey, we're just going to send the first 4 firefighters that come in to be contact teams. Okay, we're not equipped.
Right.
We're not equipped for that.
Yeah.
So if you can take your mind, are those police officers equipped, with both medical training and medical background? So it would be, to me, because some people say, well, yeah, sure, we'll send our police officers because all they're going to do is drag and drop. No, we need to provide that medical care as we're, bringing the patient to a casualty or the injured to a casualty collection point. And so your point is valid. And if we flip that switch, then maybe that's where it's more understandable that, there's a better way to do that. Right, there's a better way.
Yeah.
Most of the medical training they receive is self-aid and buddy aid.
Right.
So they're not pretty much doing either one. Now they're giving aid to someone else, and maybe requiring more advanced skills.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you. And I think as we travel the country, that's the bulk of what we see is law enforcement. They're being trained to do like you said, buddy aid, self-aid, things like that. But we also have to keep in mind that there are places where law enforcement do have advanced medical training.
Right.
I remember we did a training session out in Utah. I believe it was Richland, if I'm remembering it's been a few years ago, where their fire service was mostly volunteer. It was more of a rural area. Their law enforcement was cross-trained as EMTs and paramedics in some cases. They had ambulance EMS system that was part paid, part volunteer, this kind of mix that they've made work really well for their community.
Absolutely.
Well, they are equipped.
Yeah.
That answers the question.
They're trained
They're
and equipped to do it. And I think, to me, that's why it goes back to the idea of a contact team and an RTF as a building block is the key there. But how you staff it, that's a local that's a local issue. And in some cases, like Jill, you served I can't even remember how many years, but it was over 30 years with Jacksonville,
right?
I
started very young.
Yeah. Because you're still a very, very young lady.
Of course.
But Jacksonville has areas that are very urban,
right,
dense. You have a bunch of suburban areas, and you also have rural areas. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that your staffing in the rural areas doesn't match your staffing in the urban areas.
All right. You're exactly right.
Yeah. So there you've got an example of in a single agency, in a single jurisdiction, they're going to have different resource levels in the first 10 minutes of the response. You know, is it coming? Oh, yeah, you betcha. Going to get there. But in the first 10 minutes, what's
Right.
going to get there in the urban area is not the same as what's going to get there, you know,
True.
10 minutes in the rural area. So I think that local element really matters. So
it does.
Yeah. Yeah. So we were talking about command, and we talked about, you know, hearing the terms tactical command, forward command, all that other kind of stuff. What are the names that you've heard about for operations? Because I've heard some doozies. Forward operations.
Sure. Tactical operations.
Yeah.
You know, it just depends on what moniker they want to throw in there. It's still, you know, again, being a cop, I'm probably not the ICS purist, but you have one operation.
Yes.
That's it. No matter what it is.
Supposed to.
You got one, yes.
Yeah.
Should only be one person on the radio with operations in their name.
And those things add to the confusion we talk about. There's always problem with communication on these major incidents because of those things that we throw into it that adds to the confusion that's there. So, you know, if we look at that and say, you know, you got one operation, we don't have a tactical operation, we have flight operation, yeah, you call a helicopter, you know, so everyone could be an operation, but that just confuses it. So you give them, you know, aviation, you know, with our agency was chase, you know, that's all you do. I don't call flight operations. I don't call, you know, detective operations, investigative operations. We got one operations and everyone else has got a responsibility. They roll up to a certain person.
Yeah.
I think for those of us ICS purists, it's like operations when we're thinking medical ops, air ops, all you know, our fire ops, law enforcement ops. We're using that when there's operational periods. This is a single. It should be a single operational. You know, we're not talking about multi-day events. So that's where I think some of those operations get lost in with the, well, I'm medical ops. You know, we've got our, you know, or when we're thinking about dividing into branches. So.
Yeah. And I because here's the issue that the other thing comes in. So I've heard some people, you know, we refer to it as tactical triage and transport. We've, you know, nicknamed it Fluffy, the three-headed dog from Harry Potter. They are the ones that are operating at the edge of the warm zone or just inside the warm zone, but outside the building or the area, that are controlling everything in the hot and the warm zone. And I've had a number of people say, "Oh no, that's operations," and I'm like, no. And this is again, Jill, you accused me of sharing the super secret squirrel stuff. This is one of the places where fire service has gotten into the bad habit of, oh, well, that operations does that, and we're just gonna stand up operations. Operations is responsible for the entire operation, including staging, including perimeter, including. The only thing that operations doesn't run is the command staff, which is your liaison, your safety, and your PIO. But operations is responsible for everything. And if you push all of that up to that forward area, then you completely blow apart the delegation and delineation that we've been trying to make clear to everybody so that people aren't overloaded.
Sure.
And, oh, by the way, how is your instrument commander supposed to have a conversation with their operations chief when their operations chief isn't in the command post?
Right.
Yeah. I just find it fascinating that, you know, people see that as a semantic argument and yet still want to say, oh yeah, that's ICS compliant and no.
With that semantic also comes responsibility for that position. And that's what we've got to keep in mind is, you know, it's not just a name, it's a responsibility.
Oh, right on, Ron. That's it, Ron. Yeah, be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, no kidding. So, Jill, I want to revisit something you mentioned earlier, which was
My southern accent?
no.
Okay.
I mean, we can talk about that if you'd like.
No.
No, you mentioned span of control,
Right.
and you know, Otter, I think you were piggybacking on this to go down this road. So, obviously, radio traffic gets out of hand on these things all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Part of that is a failure to teach responders basic radio discipline, and for supervisors to straighten that out on day-to-day operations, and then
Sure.
it just kind of goes out of control when you get something bad. But the other piece of this is that radio traffic is a symptom of lack of span of control.
Sure.
So let's talk a little bit about that.
Or beyond span of control, unity of command too, because they should be answering to one person for their responsibilities, such as, contact teams are answering straight to tactical. That's the only one. You shouldn't have the incident commander reaching past and dealing with contact teams on everything he wants them to do. He should be talking to tactical, or he should be talking to operation, or not law enforcement branch, who would be talking to tactical. So we kind of circumvent both the span of control and unity of command, because we feel like, okay, I'm just going to reach past. I don't want to have to talk to these people. And that just adds confusion to everything that's going on.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. One of the things that I think, Ron, you and I learned when we were originally doing the checklist development work, because we were dealing with some pretty bad span of control issues.
Sure.
And radio traffic, especially in that initial response, was we realized that if you begin to organize this thing early on, and you get them, even just getting those dozen cops into 2 or 3 contact teams, and now all of a sudden you've got 3 people talking on the radio, tactical and contact 1 and contact 2, or 4 people if you're talking to contact 3. And then when your incident, as you begin to stand those up, all of a sudden now you've got dozens and dozens of people, but there's only a few of them that really need to be on the radio, because not everybody on that team needs to talk.
No.
And I'm sorry. The other thing is, where they're at, and you've got the accountability factor. If you've got 3 teams of 4, then each one's moving as a team of 4. You know exactly where they are, so we can minimize the blue on blue situations that may occur. But if you had those 12 people all heading in different directions, you've got no idea, and then you will have that blue on blue situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up one of the most important aspects of maintaining control on this span of control is how we bring in that dispatchers to our training, and how they are equally important as our teams, our contact teams, our rescue task force, and identifying, because there are multiple frequencies usually. We're on multiple radios. We're not talking on the same channel as our law enforcement brothers and sisters, but having someone having that dispatch component, helping us maintain that span of control. And we see it typically when we're doing some of our training. I've got one team, a rescue task force, that are together, and I've got 2, folks, both, everyone wants to talk on the radio. Now, we can also have a discussion on, conversely, no one reporting back and talking on the radio. We'll lay that on the table.
Somebody please give me an update.
An update, yeah. So we have that as well, and but identifying, like, we've got to get word, to command of a status update, and to mitigate exactly what Ron was talking about. But clearly identifying ahead of time, and dispatch does a fantastic job often of setting us straight. I'll say it, just giving us a little left and right, or repeating in a kind fashion what we should be saying or doing, or how we should be reporting. And they're a vital component in this.
It's funny. There's 2 things about dispatch that never ceases to amaze me, and we see this happen in almost every training session that they go to. You'll have a tactical be calling a contact team 5 times, or the command post is calling tactical 5 times, and they just don't hear them. And all of a sudden, dispatchers, there's just something about their voice, their cadence, the way they do it. They get on the radio, dispatch to tactical, go ahead. It's like, I just called you 5 times.
Exactly.
What are you doing to me? And then command's trying to raise you, or whatever on that. I think that is one of the things that's makes me laugh, but it's true.
Yes.
There's something about the way dispatchers speak, and their cadence, and their tone, their inflection, that we're tuned in to hear them, and yet we tune each other out.
I think because we listen to them every day, they give us our direction every day. Although they're not supervising, they're still giving us direction. They're giving us our calls and everything else. So we know that it's kind of like, like I said, when I used to get on the radio, people knew when I would come up who I was. It's kind of like the dispatchers. They know who those people are. They listen to them every day. And I think that's the key thing is, wait, if I keep messing up, I'm going to get more bad calls than good calls because they control the world. But it does. You've got a tone for we used to call it, I've got an ear for that person. And
Selective
the
hearing.
dispatchers have that ear.
Yeah, which brings me to the second thing. Dispatchers find incredibly creative ways to remind us that we forgot to do something.
Yes.
Dispatch to tactical. Can you say again what that staging location was, or where did you set staging? And everybody knows damn good and well that the guy forgot to do it. He missed it, right? But that was their like general little reminder that they needed to do it, which I think is just wonderful. There's a few agencies that have actually, after doing our training, have empowered their dispatchers to kind of help the responders work the checklist if they miss items, and I think that's great. I wish we could get a little more trust there in some other ways, but so fascinating conversation, lost in translation with the Southern accent. You're right; it's the microphone's fault.
100%.
Did we miss anything that we want to hit in this one? Because we're coming up on our time for this episode.
No, sir. The only thing I would add to it is bring the dispatchers in the trade has been phenomenal, not only for the training, but also we know that they've listened to these incidents forever. Now they get to listen to it and see what's actually going on. So then they say, now I understand why they're doing that. So if I take this step, I can help facilitate that. And I think that's why they become more involved, because now I get what you're talking about now.
Yeah.
We never did that to explain to them what was going on.
Yeah, they get that element of being able to look across the room and see what's happening and understand who's doing what, and suddenly they're in the same training with the rest of us.
And they're doing the job they do all the time, trying to keep us safe.
Amen. Amen. Jill, anything else?
Yeah, no, the only thing I added, and we try to bring this up in every training, is that terms matter. Terminology does matter. And keeping it common is matter. That's why it's so important that common terminology, we keep pushing for that, and we keep correcting, and we thank our dispatchers for correcting our titles when we say the wrong title the first 3 or maybe 5 times. And by correcting that, because it will absolutely bring that chaotic scene, bring more order, because we know who is responsible. It aligns clearly with the area of responsibility. So common terminology, super important, so that things aren't lost in translation.
It is, and I think that my last closing thought on this would be, you and your neighbor don't have to have the same procedures, but you damn sure need to know what their procedures are, and they need to know what your procedures are, because when your neighbors come, and they're gonna come, and they roll into your jurisdiction, they need to know what your plan is.
Yeah.
They need to know how you do it. They need to know your thing, your terminology, your communication, your structure, and if you've done a good job, they've been included in your training, and they already know it. So thank you guys both for coming back in to follow this up. This was fun. Jill, we'll get you a new microphone that gets rid of that Southern accent for you.
Brand.
Yeah, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you have not subscribed to the podcast, please do so. Please share it with your friends. That's how we can help people learn how to do better in these tragic events. I'd like to thank our producer, Carla Torres, and everybody for their time and sitting in and listening. With that, until next time, stay safe. Thank you.